Shiites and Sunnis, two words that echo whenever we hear about the Middle East, terrorist attacks, religious wars, or political rivalries. But few know what truly separates these two forces within Islam. The origin isn't in complex doctrines. It lies in a deep cut, a disputed succession, an unresolved death, a silence that became an abyss. Today, Shiites and Sunnis clash on battlefields, in parliaments, in fiery sermons, and in international alliances. But in the beginning, they stood side by side. Both followed Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. Both prayed in the same direction, recited the same verses, and dreamed of the same paradise. What happened? The answer is brutal. It all began with a death. When Muhammad passed away in 632 AD, he didn't leave a clear successor. What should have been a moment of mourning became the spark of a historical schism that even today fuels wars, justifies revolutions, and shapes entire governments. In this video, you'll understand how a disagreement over who should lead the Muslim community transformed into 1,000 years of conflicts, divergent doctrines, and opposing identities. From the martyrdom of Husayn to the rise of the Ayatollahs, passing through caliphates and empires, will reveal how a single choice shaped the destiny of millions. Prepare to return to the sands of Medina and the ashes of Karbala, because to understand the present of the Middle East, you must look at its oldest wound, and it still bleeds. It all began with a silence charged with shock, uncertainty, and fear. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, had died. The man who united warring tribes, founded a religion, defeated empires, and transformed the Arabian desert into sacred ground, was gone. And with his death, doubt hung like a storm over Medina. Who would succeed him? The nascent Islam was orphaned, and the Muslim world, still fragile, needed a new leader. But Muhammad left no clear political will. He did not formally indicate a successor. He did not designate a caliph. He only left a spiritual legacy, and the hope that his community would know what to do. That's when the conflict began. On one side was Abu Bakr, a close friend of Muhammad, a respected, calm, and strategic man. He represented the elders of the Quraysh tribe, the traditional leaders of Mecca. Many saw him as the logical choice, a companion of the prophet, mature, trustworthy, who had already led prayers in his absence. On the other side, there was a name that resonated with blood and hereditary right: Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, the first young man to embrace Islam, a faithful warrior, and for many, the prophet's legitimate spiritual heir. After all, wasn't Muhammad's blood flowing in his veins? The tension was palpable, and time would not wait. In a decisive meeting called Saqifa, the community leaders, without the presence of Ali and his family, chose Abu Bakr as the first caliph. It was a gesture of urgency, but also of exclusion. Ali's followers, later called Shiite Ali, the party of Ali, considered that choice illegitimate. For them, the true leader should be designated by blood ties and by divine appointment. What was a political choice became a theological dividing line. Those who followed Abu Bakr would become the Sunnis, from the word sunnah, meaning tradition. They believed that the community should elect its leaders based on wisdom and experience, not on blood. The caliph, for them, was an administrator of the faith, not a spiritual successor. Ali's followers would become the Shiites, from the word Shia, meaning faction or party. For them, leadership was sacred, transmitted by divine right to Muhammad's descendants, the Imams. The authority was not political, it was spiritual and unquestionable. From that day on, two worldviews were born, two ways of seeing power, faith, and destiny, two paths that would cross, clash, and shed much blood. And Ali? He did not protest, at least, not openly. He swore allegiance to Abu Bakr, for a time, to preserve unity. But the seed of division had already been planted, and it would grow like a twisted tree, whose branches would span centuries of history. Medina would never be the same. If the death of Muhammad opened a wound, it was in Karbala that it bled violently. Decades had passed since Abu Bakr's selection. Islam had expanded, cities fell, empires trembled, and the Muslim world stretched from North Africa to Central Asia. But while the caliphs in Damascus celebrated conquests, an underground tension grew like embers beneath the sand. The succession of caliphs continued to Umar, then Uthman, and finally Ali, who at last came to power, but too late. Ali governed an unstable caliphate, divided, threatened by factions and betrayals. His rule ended with a blade. He was assassinated during prayers in a mosque in Kufa. The blood of the Prophet's lineage had been spilled, and it would not be the last time. After Ali's death, power fell into the hands of Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and founder of the Umayyad dynasty. He centralized the caliphate in Damascus, creating a disguised Islamic monarchy. His son Yazid would inherit the throne, and with it the wrath of Ali's followers. It was into this scenario that the Prophet's grandson entered, Husayn ibn Ali. Husayn refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid. For him, spiritual leadership could not be corrupted by a regime of luxury, inheritance, and political power. And so he set out with his family and a few followers towards Kufa, responding to the call for support from the Shiites of that city. But along the way, they were intercepted by Yazid's troops. In the desert of Karbala, surrounded, without water, starving, Husayn's 72 companions faced an army of thousands. The day was the 10th of Muharram, the sacred month, and on that dry ground, history was sculpted in pain. Husayn, his young son, his brothers, nephews, companions, all dead. Their heads were taken to Damascus as trophies, and the women of his family were taken as prisoners. The Prophet's heir was massacred by Muslims in the name of the Caliph. Karbala was not just a tragedy, it was the Shiite crucifixion. It was the foundational trauma, the point of no return, a legacy of mourning and resistance. Since then, Shiites have come to see history as a lament, the world as unjust, power as something that always betrays the righteous. Husayn became the eternal martyr, the symbol of sacrifice against tyranny, and his name would echo in cries of pain at every Ashura, every reenactment, every flagellation of devotees' own bodies. For Sunnis, Karbala was a tragedy, yes, but one among many. For Shiites, it was the apocalypse, and any authority that disregarded Husayn's blood was illegitimate. Ali was not merely the first imam, Husayn was the redeemer, and Karbala, the lost Eden. From that point on, the division ceased to be merely political. It became spiritual, cultural, emotional. Where Sunnis saw organization, Shiites saw oppression. Where Sunnis saw history, Shiites saw mourning. Where Sunnis followed tradition, Shiites carried the trauma. And so two Islams began to walk side by side, separated by a battlefield. After Karbala, the division between Sunnis and Shiites ceased to be a dispute over succession. It became a way of living, thinking, and believing. It wasn't just about who should lead. It was about how to lead, why lead, and what faith meant in the heart of every Muslim. Sunni Islam. Tradition and community. For Sunnis, tradition Sunnah was the guide. The Quran, the Prophet's teachings, and the collective practice of the first rightly guided caliphs formed the basis of orthodoxy. The leader, the caliph, was the guardian of Sharia, unity, and Islamic practice. Authority was functional, practical, administrative. The focus was on the community. Shiite Islam, lineage, and mysticism. Shiites, on the other hand, followed a more esoteric path. They believed that the true leaders should be direct descendants of Muhammad, guided by God, bearers of inner knowledge, the sacred gnosis. These leaders were the imams, not just religious authorities, but mystical bridges between heaven and earth. The focus was on lineage and redemptive suffering, shaping centuries of culture. This contrast shaped centuries of culture. While the Islamic Empire expanded with Sunni caliphs ruling vast lands, from the Umayyads to the Abbasids, from the Seljuk Turks to the Ottomans, Shiites organized themselves into minority communities, persecuted, marginalized, but deeply united by their identity of resistance. Shiites began to develop a theology of pain. Injustice was a central element of their spirituality. The martyr was more valuable than the warrior. The silence of the hidden imam was worth more than the caliph's discourse. and each Ashura became not just a ceremony, but a collective catharsis. In the Sunni world, legal schools, madhab, Islamic law scholars, ulamas, and the pursuit of stability and diversity flourished. There was pragmatism. There were empires, but there was also the risk of rigidity. In the Shiite world, there was poetry, mysticism, concealment. There was secrecy. The 12th disappeared imam, awaited as a messiah. There was passion, weeping, reenacted blood, and hope for cosmic justice. National identities and enduring division over the centuries, entire countries were shaped by this symbolic abyss. In Iran, for example, Shi'ism became the official religion in the 16th century, with the rise of the Safavid dynasty. There the Shiites ceased to be the oppressed, and became the state. Ashura became political, pain became a banner. The figure of the Ayatollah would emerge much later, but there the embryo of what would become modern Iran was born, a Shiite theocracy with a vocation for global resistance. Meanwhile, in Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, Mecca, Sunni Islam organized itself into institutions, sultanates, universities, alliances with the Western world, and power distributed among scholars and rulers. It was a more legal, more institutional Islam, but the distance between the two visions grew. They read the same Quran, they prayed in the same direction, they fasted in the same Ramadan, but they lived in different worlds. The division between Sunnis and Shiites was not just a chapter of history, it was a method of interpreting the sacred, a memory of blood, and a political projection. And even today, many conflicts in the Middle East, from Iraq to Yemen, from Bahrain to Lebanon, cannot be understood without this dual lens. The struggle for power, the fight for territories, the clashes with the West, everything is filtered by this ancient fracture that began with a hurried burial in Medina and exploded on the field of Karbala. Two Islams, two memories, two destinies, intertwined. If until then, Shiites and Sunnis had diverged in ideas and doctrines, it was on the battlefield that the division crystallized. What was faith also became a banner. What was memory became an army. And what was spirituality turned into geopolitics. In the 16th century, two Islamic colossi emerged in opposite directions. On one side, the Ottoman Empire, Sunni, powerful, with its capital in Constantinople; on the other, the Safavid Empire, Shiite, with its seat in Isfahan in the heart of Iran. Two Muslim giants, brothers in origin, rivals in essence. The Ottoman Sultan saw himself as the legitimate caliph of Islam, the protector of sacred places, the heir to the Prophet's sword. The Safavid Shah, on the other hand, claimed the mission of purifying the faith, restoring the authority of the imams, and building a sacred state based on justice and martyrdom. And so, the map of the Middle East was drawn with bullets, blood, and swords. The war between these empires was not just territorial, it was theological. The Ottomans called the Safavids heretics. The Safavids accused the Ottomans of spiritual corruption. Both prayed to Allah, but hated each other with fervor. Mosques were destroyed. Pilgrims were attacked. Religious rhetoric inflamed the soldiers. Battles were not just for provinces, but for souls. It was during this period that Iran officially became Shiite, as resistance to Ottoman Sunni dominance. A political choice, but also an existential one. The Safavid dynasty executed Sunni clerics, reformed rituals, promoted the cult of the imams, and transformed Shi'ism into a pillar of Persian national identity. Meanwhile, the Ottomans expanded their domains to the Balkans, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, bringing with them a structured, institutional Sunni Islam linked to the Sultan's power. It was a complex chessboard, where the two empires clashed and influenced the destiny of millions. What began as a dispute after Muhammad's death now shaped borders, alliances, and cultures. But there was something deeper. While the Western world experienced the Renaissance, and Europe was transformed by the Reformation and maritime expansion, the Islamic world was divided, inward-looking, corroded by internal wars. The creative energy of early Islam gave way to rigidity, censorship, and sectarianism. Shi'ism developed its own religious hierarchy, marked by the authority of the Ayatollahs. Sunnism strengthened its legal schools and approached colonial empires to ensure survival. Both sides lost something. The spirit of unity that had transformed tribes into civilizations, but the memory of the Imams, for the Shiites, did not die. It grew stronger. Every blow from the Ottomans was seen as a repetition of Karbala. Every defeat was a test. Every resistance, a step towards final justice. And Iran, even surrounded by Sunnis, remained a Shiite sanctuary, guarding its rituals, its processions, its tears, and its doctrine, like a flame lit under the wind. This chapter of history showed that religious ideas can become walls, and sacred words can become borders. The division between Shiites and Sunnis was no longer merely theological. It was engraved in the land, in the walls, in the mosques, in the books, in the songs, and on the flags. Islam had split in two, and the world would never be the same. If the past had separated Shiites and Sunnis by theology, martyrdom, and empires, the 20th century would separate them by something even more volatile: oil, power, and foreign manipulation. With the fall of the Islamic empires, Ottoman and Persian, the Muslim world was torn apart like a map ripped on the table of colonial powers. France and England carved up the Middle East with a ruler and compass, ignoring tribes, cultures, and of course, the millennial rivalry between Shiites and Sunnis. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 drew artificial borders that placed Shiites under Sunni governments, and Sunnis under Shiite crowns. In Iraq, for example, the British installed a Sunni monarch in a Shiite majority country. It was a ticking time bomb. Oil began to be exploited, and with it, the interest of the great powers only grew. The oil wells of Abadan, in Iran, gushed wealth, but not for Iranians. British and American companies controlled everything. Humiliation grew, injustice fermented. It was in this environment that one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century emerged: Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Shiite cleric, a revolutionary, a symbol of accumulated resentment. In 1979, he led the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Shah was deposed, the West was expelled, and Shiite Iran proclaimed itself a theocratic republic, based on the teachings of the Imams and the martyrs of Karbala. Khomeini's revolution shook the Sunni world. The Gulf regimes, monarchies allied with the United States and firmly Sunni, trembled. Saudi Arabia, in particular, saw Iran as an existential enemy. It was the rebirth of the conflict, now in a new language: revolutionary Shiism versus monarchical Sunni Wahhabism. The Saudi response was immediate: more funding for Sunni mosques worldwide, more internal repression against any Shiite sympathizer, more support for groups that could contain Iranian influence. The Middle East became a bloody chessboard, where each country was a pawn in a sectarian conflict disguised as geopolitics. In the Iran-Iraq War, for example, Saddam Hussein, a Sunni dictator, invaded Shiite Iran with the tacit support of the US and Arab monarchies. The conflict lasted 8 years, 1 million dead, chemical gas, child soldiers, martyrs on both sides, and no winner. The blood of Karbala seemed to gush again, now at the hands of modern armies, tanks and missiles, a never-ending cycle. From then on, every regional conflict began to carry this hidden code. Syria, with its Alawite Shiite regime sustained by Iran and fought by Sunni rebels. Yemen, with the Shiite Houthis facing a Sunni coalition led by Saudi Arabia. Bahrain, a Shiite majority ruled by a Sunni monarchy. Lebanon, with the Shiite Hezbollah, a direct arm of Iran. And in every corner, the US, Israel, Russia, and China playing their chips, fueling rivalries, selling weapons, sustaining regimes. What for many is just Middle East tension, for those who know history is the continuation of a wound open for 1,400 years. A duel between two ways of living Islam, two ways of remembering the Prophet, two ways of awaiting the end of times. And while the dead accumulate, the powerful discuss contracts, pipelines and zones of influence. The war between Shiites and Sunnis, fueled by memory, dogma, pride and wounds, has become a tragic cycle of recycled, manipulated, and ever-ignited hatred. When wounds don't heal, they fester. And so it was with the rivalry between Shiites and Sunnis. The 21st century began like a minefield: wars, revolutions, insurgencies. But beneath every geopolitical conflict, there was a sectarian tension about to explode, and it did. After the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the United States left a power vacuum. The Sunni dictator had governed a Shiite-majority country with an iron fist. His downfall unleashed old resentments. Shiites, marginalized for centuries, rose to power. Sunnis in turn felt betrayed, humiliated, voiceless. The rise of ISIS and sectarian war on this poisoned ground, the most brutal group of the century was born, the Islamic State ISIS. Composed predominantly of extremist Sunnis, ISIS emerged as a violent reaction not only to the West, but also to the political advance of Shiites in Iraq and Iranian influence in the region. Their caliphate promised to restore Islamic glory, but at the cost of a bloodbath. In Mosul, Tikrit, Raqqa, and Kobani, jihadists destroyed Shiite mosques, desecrated shrines, massacred minorities. In meticulously produced videos, they showed public executions of Shiites labeled as apostates. The enemy for them was not just the Christian or Jewish infidel. It was the brother who followed Islam the wrong way. On the other side, Shiite militias were no less brutal. With direct support from Iran, groups like the Quds Force, Hezbollah, and the Hashd al-Shaabi responded with equal brutality. On battlefields in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, they waged wars of extermination, painted with the brush of theology, but guided by political interest. The human cost and external manipulation, the people, in the midst of it all, suffer. In Baghdad, a market blown up by a car bomb bears the name of Karbala. In Damascus, Sunni neighborhoods turn to ruins for confronting the Shiite regime of Bashar al-Assad. In Yemen, hospitals are destroyed as Sunnis and Shiites fight for a phantom government. And while leaders sermonize in the name of God, children are buried in the name of an inherited hatred. The fanaticism that fuels these wars is not new. It draws from the wellspring of martyrs, assassinated imams, betrayed caliphs. It transforms memory into ammunition, devotion into fuel for the eternal fire of sectarianism. Social media amplifies this war. Inflammatory sermons spread like a virus. Preachers call others dogs, pigs, apostates. A Shiite with the wrong name is killed at a checkpoint. A Sunni is excluded from public office. Religion has become a code for war, but there is a dark detail. The more divided Muslims are, the more external interests benefit. The arms industry prospers, powers maintain their influence, oil companies renew contracts, and peoples who share the same sacred book continue to kill each other over the footnotes of history. Meanwhile, Mecca and Najaf, Medina and Qom, continue to be places of faith for millions, but also, silently, epicenters of an armed spiritual dispute. In the midst of the noise, few voices dare to ask, how long will the memory of Karbala be used as justification for new tragedies? Amidst the barren desert of division, some believe that reconciliation between Shiites and Sunnis is merely a mirage. Centuries of bloodshed, retaliations, rival doctrines, martyrs, revered by some and cursed by others. How can a fabric torn for so long be mended? But every story has its rebels against the logic of repetition. In the narrow streets of Baghdad, young people from both branches are starting to attend the same universities, play the same music, and laugh at the same bitter jokes about politicians who use God as a shield. They know that being born Shiite or Sunni was an accident, not a choice, and they know that dying for it would be foolish. In Beirut, a Shiite mosque helps bombing victims without asking their names or checking their creed. In Tehran, Sunnis attend prayers with fear, but also with faith. In Cairo, scholars try to build bridges between jurisprudences, even if their words are lost in the din of weapons, but the tension continues. Iran still funds militias. Saudi Arabia still exports its puritanical vision. Mosques continue with their partisan sermons, and school textbooks on both sides teach that the other is wrong, if not cursed. The pressing question is, Did religion shape politics, or did politics hijack religion? Because in the beginning, Muhammad didn't found an army, he founded a community, the Ummah, and it is this ideal of Ummah, of a Muslim brotherhood, above tribes, schools, names, that seems to have been buried under the rubble of Karbala, the trenches of Baghdad, and the cold corridors of the UN. But perhaps, from some lost minaret, a final call to prayer still echoes with sincerity. A call that says God is greater than our divisions. For this to happen, courage will be needed. Courage to face not the other, but the history we carry like a sword. Courage to say my martyr is no more important than your suffering. Courage to bury not just the dead, but the discourses that continue to kill the living. It won't be easy. Those who preach reconciliation often die before seeing the fruits. But every gesture, every bridge, every just word thrown between Shiites and Sunnis is like a seed planted among stones. And sometimes, even in the desert, flowers are born, because before they are Shiites or Sunnis, they are human. They suffer, they love, they hope. And if Muhammad once wept for his divided community, perhaps there is still time to honor his legacy, not with war, but with truth. Continue your journey with sand and blood. If this story impacted you, it's because it still lives. What began in the desert is now reflected in every headline, every border, and every prayer interrupted by gunfire. But behind the maps and the weapons, there are people, there is faith, there is history. That's why the Sand and Blood channel exists. Here we unearth the events that shaped the Middle East, unfiltered, without simplification. We tell the origins, the conflicts, the traumas, and the possible paths. If you want to understand the world beyond the headlines, subscribe now. Comment what you thought of this episode, which chapter impacted you the most. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that the past still burns in the present, and activate the bell, because the next episode might change how you see an entire people. Sand and Blood, where every grain carries a war, and every name, a story.